Greetings, programs, and welcome back. Back from my holiday, visiting the farm, doing altogether too much work. Today's episode is a long one, and it contains discussions of phobias and strong emotions. Also talk about things like wasps and spiders, so you have been warned. Episode 9, Non-Duality 2. What is all this stuff, and what is the point of it all? So we're back on non-duality today. For those of you coming in late, check out my video on it, about how you have no free will and basically don't exist. No, this is not some bizarre philosophical thing. This is based on simply looking for the thing that you thought was always there, because it feels like it is, and then on examination, it turns out not to exist. See footnote number 1 for my earlier non-duality vid going over this in greater detail. Also, while a lot of this stuff comes from ancient Indian and Buddhist traditions, I am only talking about the mind part of the stuff, not magical things like prayers and reincarnation, just things you can check for yourself with 10 quiet minutes to yourself. But to recap briefly, you feel like a person who can make free choices. Chocolate or vanilla, stay up or go to bed, left or right. But you don't. Those choices are driven by desires and triggers that you are unaware of. So unaware that with an fMRI machine, a simple choice you make, such as lifting either your left hand or your right, can be predicted seconds in advance. As many as 7 seconds with current technology. Any choices you make are not made by the conscious mind, they just happen. If there is any decision making, it happens in the subconscious, and the conscious mind simply lays claim to what happened. After all, it's not like there's anyone else here in your head with you, is there? So it must have been you. Or to put it another way, you can do what you want, but you can't want what you want. Footnote number 2, a very short thing on RoboCop. Yes, the actual fairly terrible movie where they explain free will in less than a minute, quite cool. And footnote number 3, Sam Harris's talk on free will that goes over this in great and exhaustive detail. Free will is only part of today's talk, not the entirety of it. I recommend looking at the Sam Harris video because it is awesome. Also, to go along with the illusion of free will is the illusion of self. Much like the concept of free will, it's not real either. It is an illusion, much as the idea of clear eyesight. You look at the world through a mass of blood vessels, the actual cells that make up the retina, and 2 giant-ass blind spots. And yet, unless you do some very specific things, you can't see any of this. Your eyesight looks clear, because your brain edits it out of your consciousness. See footnote number 4 on how to see your blind spot. However, the blood vessels that I was just talking about can be seen quite easily by taking a pocket light and shining it in the corner of your eye. Then you just wiggle it around a bit. So point it in the outside corner of your eye, more or less at a steep angle, across your face rather than into your eye, and wiggle it around a bit. Sooner or later you will see a sudden and bizarre branching pattern. Those are the blood vessels in your eye. You see them all the time, but your brain edits them out. Your brain does this with all sorts of things, like sight and sound. This is why you can watch a movie where the sound is a little bit out of sync with the picture without even noticing, because your brain processes sight and sound at different rates, and then tells the conscious mind afterwards that, yeah, this lines up, just go with it. The same hardware lets you see people speaking on a screen, even though the sound is coming from speakers that are either at either side of the screen or underneath it. With all this going on, is it any wonder that the only people who spotted this stuff until recently are people in the East who live in caves and meditate a lot? Well, they may not have known about the inner truths of the universe, but they knew a lot about the human mind, and modern neuroscience is slowly catching up, now that we actually have modern neuroscience. So to recap the illusion of self, sit down and do a mental inventory. What exists in your mind? Thoughts appear unbidden and not of your choosing? They are not you, they are just happening to you. If you try to recall something, you can, but memories are records, not who you are. And there are sensations, feelings of you sitting down, things you can smell, that strange colour you get when you close your eyes, which is another one of those tricky things. Just close your eyes. Unless the sun is shining on your eyelids, you don't just see red, you see other colours. Really look, see what I'm talking about. Is there anything else in your mind? Thoughts, sensations, memories, what else is there? Emotions? Sure, they're there, But anybody who's ever suffered a panic attack, anxiety, or depression will know that emotions are also things that happen to you, not necessarily you yourself. Much like thoughts you'd prefer not pop into your head, emotions can just happen to you. If you have never experienced such things, have you ever noticed how you can be grumpy and irritable if you don't get your cup of coffee in the morning? Or if you knock back a few espressos, you get all nervy and twitchy? Same kind of idea. Is there anything else in your mind? Thoughts, sensations, emotions and memories? What else is there? Really look. Assume that I got it all wrong. Prove me wrong and tell me what else you find in your mind. And if you look and look, won't find anything. And when you realize this, you may be awed, or frightened, or simply shrug and say, okay, so what? It varies from person to person. Commonly, this is called passing through the gateless gate. So to describe it as a metaphor, you have your eyes closed and you walk through what you think is a gateway. But when you open your eyes and look around, there's no actual gateway there. This is the same kind of thing. It's kind of huge and kind of trivial all at the same time. My likening of it is to a trust fund. You go through college, knowing that when you graduate and turn 21, you come into a huge trust fund and get loads of money. And then, when you turn 21 and graduate, the trust fund turns out to be a mistake, or a scam. There is no money. There never was any money. On the one hand, you thought you were going to be rich, and you planned your life accordingly. But on the other hand, there is no change at all. There never was any money, and there still is no money. The only change is, now you're aware that there's no money, and you are not making plans based on something that doesn't exist. It was the illusion of money, much as this is. Gindlin said it best. What is true is already so. Owning up to it doesn't make it worse. Not being open about it doesn't make it go away. And because it is true, it is what there is to be interacted with. Anything untrue is not there to be lived. People can stand what is true, for they are already enduring it. This is a quote by Eugene Gendel. And I have to be honest, I do find it surprising how many people still hold on to the belief from childhood that if you don't think about a thing, or don't investigate it, it won't actually be real. Well, this is the same. We all assume that we have a self because we feel like we do, but as soon as you really and honestly look, it's not there in your mind to be found. So, assuming I haven't gone completely crazy, why is it that we feel like we do have an internal self? Well, in short, stimulation. The constant input of sight and sound, touch, constantly reinforces the idea that there is someone there to be experiencing them. But like a computer monitoring system that monitors constant input, you do the same. The computer does the same things, but it does it without a self, which is just one reason that people in isolation or sensory deprivation tanks sometimes lose their sense of self, because there is no more input to constantly reinforce that sense. So why does this even happen in the first place? Well, it's early days in the research yet, but the answer seems to be the same answer as all the other weird quirks of human nature. Evolution. A creature with some sense of self would probably fight harder to stay alive than a creature that simply accepted inputs and then responded accordingly. Especially if the creature with the sense of self ended up overreacting. While evolutionary speaking, an overreaction will have some cost, the cost will generally be lower than the cost of underreacting. If you run screaming every time there's a rustle in the grass, terrified in fear, you're going to waste some calories. But if one time in 100 it's a hungry tiger, you're going to live. And the person who is not overreacting eventually gets eaten. Overly simplistic? Sure, but that's more or less how natural selection works. And that brings me on to my main point. What is all this good for? Is there anything to this other than idle curiosity or mental masturbation? Well, yes, and it relates to what I just mentioned. Most of us are not in danger of being eaten by tigers. So our senses and mental tendencies, which suited us greatly to the plains and jungles and lions and tigers, are a bit overkill these days. And anxiety and depression are a big deal in the modern world, because we are not evolved for the modern world. We are evolved for small family groups, hunting and living together, and operating at a much slower pace of life. And none of us ever had to wonder why or what to do with our lives. Staying alive took all the time and all the effort. And that unhappiness, that feeling that something's wrong, that nagging depression that many of us suffer from, and that restlessness to fix it, that's probably what drove our ancestors out of Africa. It's great for the species, but if you're the individual with it, it ain't that great. And thus, we are all wound a little too tight. And this is where mindfulness in general, and acceptance of non-duality can help. Everybody's experience, everybody's life is going to be different, but I can tell you what I have found and how it helped me. Now keep in mind, this is all about tinkering with your mental equilibrium. Not getting smarter or stronger, so it's all internal. And the only evidence you're going to get is basically how you feel if you do it, or other people's testimonials, which, as we all know, count for precisely dick, and the evidence of changed lives, which people like Christians misattribute all the time. So yeah, it's not something you can easily measure or provide evidence for. How do you scientifically measure a sense of peace? Well, you can ask people, but that's about all you're going to get. But anyway, here goes. The process I did was one of the many varieties of the 10 fetters process, which is one of several Eastern-inspired processes for breaking down illusion. They do not all deal with the same things in the same order, but the order I went through them I shall list, and I shall tell you what I got out of it. So, the first fetter, the first step, the self, also called the gateless gate. Primarily an ice-breaking step. It shows you that there is no inner self that I spoke of earlier. Mainly, when you get it, it teaches you the very important lesson that a lot of what you assumed about the world and yourself is just not true. Similar to the realization that you lack free will, it doesn't directly change anything, but it can allow changes to happen. One thing I found was a sense of reduced stress for the choices I'd made, and a reduction of guilt for the little things, like not having made my bed yet, or not having done the dishes. Small things, but welcome. Why? Well, because there was no option for things to have been different. By simply accepting the fact that I don't have free will, and that there's no self to actually be deciding things, even if I think there is, I can relax about the things that I do, or do not do. It might be preferable if things were otherwise, but the world is as it is, and stressing about it won't change anything. And this has been borne out in experimentation. As Sam Harris points out in his talks about free will, the reduction in the sense of responsibility measurably leads to a reduction in stress about things like cheating on tests, and thus leads to an increase in cheating. This is an obvious downside, but the point about reduced stress is the major point here. Keep in mind, this illusion of self is not claiming that you don't exist. Look down. See yourself. Clearly you do. The claim is that the you are not what you thought you were, and that your assumptions about what you are not correct. So that's the biggie. That's the icebreaker. Doesn't really do a lot, but you can get a distinct sense of, whoa, dude, when you catch on. I found it to be very impressive. Doesn't work that way for everybody, but it's apparently quite a common reaction. Now, on to the second fetter. Doubt. This was portrayed to me as an inability to accept what is, to remain alarmed or unsatisfied by doubt, to constantly worry. As a skeptic, I'd become comfortable with not knowing things, and not turning to magical explanation, if no information on the subject was available. Now, this was a non-issue for me. But can you imagine what a relief it would be to stop worrying about the unknown? To be okay with just saying, I don't know, and not to have to make up something, anything, to avoid having to deal with not knowing things? That would be a powerful change for someone who didn't have that mindset already. Now that's just a brief one, because I'd kind of already done that when I showed up. So, you know, if you were to go through one of these sort of training processes, some things would be big deals for you and not for me, and vice versa. So that one was pretty easy for me. Now, the third fetter. Attachment to rules and rituals. This was another non-issue. It was described to me as what often happens if a person cannot control their world sufficiently, and thus they invent or find and cling to rituals and rites to attempt to control the uncontrollable. Whether this be some subconscious magical thinking and thinking that doing things in a certain ritualistic way, or just appealing to gods and other supernatural beings will get us out of this mess. Superstition, in other words. And it comes down to fundamental misattribution. You did a thing, there was a result, ergo these two things are connected. Experiments have shown that animals as different from us as pigeons can end up with superstition. Pigeon looks over its left shoulder and randomly some food appears in the tray, then it can end up thinking that looking over its left shoulder is what made the food appear. Superstition for pigeons. Again, while this was not really on my radar, can you imagine the weight of rituals and responsibility lifted by simply accepting that things just happen? The costs in wasted time, energy and mental stress in doing things to affect the outcome of things cannot be changed. Or to put it another way, stressing and wearing your lucky red hat won't get you over an illness any faster, so just chill. This one and the previous one is something I generally characterize as just accept the world as it is and not how you wish it were instead. Or if you want it even shorter and in 2 words alone, just chill. Now, we're on to the big ones. Fetters 4 and 5. This was the big one for me. This was the one that sort of changed my life. Desire and ill will, they're called. The 2 big ones. And most of the writings on the subject treat them as different faces of the same coin. This is one of the ones that can really change how you see the world and has a noticeable effect on how you live your life. Especially if you are prone to phobias, depression, anxiety and such. This one is about the emotional triggers that we attach to sensation. Basically, when we experience an emotion, such as fear and anxiety, we feel a physical sensation that goes along with it. If you've ever suffered such things, you'll know what it feels like. Clenched stomach, sinking sensation, a racing heartbeat, all that. Well, no, we don't. What actually happens is we feel a sensation in our body, which we then attribute emotions to. The likes of Darren Brown can exploit this to manipulate those emotions. For example, an increased heart rate is one of the common symptoms of attraction. It is also one of the common symptoms of apprehension or anxiety. So they were able to increase the apparent attractiveness of an actress by putting her on the far side of a rickety walkway. The subject then met her while feeling an elevated heart rate, which they themselves then subconsciously linked to the woman standing in front of her, and then assumed she was therefore more attractive. See footnote number 5, the Sam Harris Darren Brown interview where they go over this and many other manipulative techniques in greater detail. Well, it works for other emotions too. Think of a thing that causes you anxiety. This is the bit I warned you about at the start. Whether it be something like a fight with your significant other, or getting bad news about a loved one, getting a bad performance review at work. For those of you with phobias, think about the thing that sets you off. For me, it's wasps. When I was a kid, there were a lot of wasps hanging around the rubbish bins in the school playground. And when they get angry at you, they buzz angrily around your head where you cannot see them, right behind you. And if you manage to swat them, they often come back and sting you. Now, as an adult, I can tell you that a wasp sting for me feels about as bad as slowly pulling out a hair with a tweezer. Or getting one of the aforementioned hairs caught in a seam or a zip and tugged a bit. Pretty tiny. Not worthy of fear. And, given that my family kept bees, I have been stung vastly more often and more painfully by bees. But that happened to me with an adult mind. This wasp phobia is a result of stress and fear embedded in the mind of a child. I was only a kid at the time. Now, put it in context, I recently was working for my mum on the farm. This is why there haven't been any updates in a couple. And I came across an area that I was working in that was patrolled by wasps. While working in a mix of light and dark caused by blazing summer sun, as seen through trees, while wearing shades that were all fogged up from the sweat, and no glasses. Yeah, I wear glasses. So I got to experience the sensations of my phobia. As soon as I heard the sound of wasps flying around and saw their movements, I freaked. For those that don't have a phobia of wasps, wasps have a very distinctive flight pattern. They investigate things. They have a search pattern. Flies just zoom around madly. And bees are heavy flyers with a much lower wing pitch. Only wasps fly like they are scanning the ground for targets. Now, I felt the clenched stomach, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the sensations of blood moving around and adrenaline as my fight and flight response kicked in, and I responded instinctively by backing off. Okay, so what? Well, this gave me the perfect chance to analyze what had just happened and deal with it. And what I found was that after I became aware of the wasps, I felt the physical sensation. And then I attributed fear to those feelings, out of habit really. And then I reacted to that fear by going yikes and running away like a big ninny. But when I stopped to examine that process with a clearer mind, I could see all the parts happening. And when I went back to where the wasps were, which I had to do because my job was to clear all that bush out, and well, yeah, they were in the way, I could feel all the sensations in my body, and realize that I don't have to take the next step. That the attribution of emotions to those sensations is something that I can control, that I don't have to do if I don't want to. And so I could accept the sensations of hairs on the back of my neck standing up, or tightness in my stomach, and then not attach fear to it. And in the absence of fear, I could avoid running away like a ninny and get on with the job. That is a powerful tool for people with anxiety, or depression, or phobia. The ability to disconnect to a degree the feelings that occur in the body from the emotional response to them. And that's the key thing. Most of the pain or suffering we feel from things is self-inflicted. Left to themselves, without us rehearsing them or rehashing them over and over in our minds, any negative emotional response fades away in only a few seconds. It's only when we rehash it and go over it again and again, triggering it with every pass, that the negative emotion remains for longer than a few seconds. And this is not new. Hell, people have been writing it in sci-fi books. Remember this: I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is a little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. When it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. And where fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. Bene Gesserit Litany Against Fear. When you force yourself to stop and examine what you're actually feeling in them, not what you imagine you might be feeling, or that you think you should feel or do, but what you can actually sense, you discover it's just a sensation in your body. No better or worse than a twitching muscle, or an odd pain that shoots through you with no explanation and then simply goes away. When that happens, we don't attribute any terrible sensations or feelings to them, unless we have been primed by, say, a doctor saying, watch out for this thing. Most of us will have experienced this while working and injuring ourselves. We work away, concentrating on what we are doing, and bump into a jagged bit of metal or a sharp thing, and feel a bit of an itch or a sting, but pay no attention, because, hey, we're busy. But when we see the blood spots on the floor and stop and see the blood running down our arm, then we feel the pain, and it's not just an itch anymore. Why? Because we do it to ourselves. Sometimes we don't even notice at all, and find a healing scab days later and wonder, where the hell did this come from? And for me, this step was massive. I deal with anxiety and depression. But now, rather than causing me stress, they're just feelings that happen to me and pass me by. No anxiety attacks, no feeling down for the whole day. I just recognize that there is a feeling in my chest. Mentally look at it, note that it is there, take a deep breath, because that's almost never a bad thing, and then it is gone. Takes about 2 to 3 seconds. Because I don't rehash it over and over again. Same with depression. I can just note that my emotions are skewing negative and kind of gloomy, and not read too much into it. Just acknowledge that today my emotions are not under my control, though really they never are, and then just make the best of it. And because I'm not moping around, focusing on how much life sucks, I find that it doesn't last too long. Often food will make it go away, or a nice cup of tea. So it might often just be a tiredness or a blood sugar thing. Because really, what does a tight feeling in your chest really mean anyway? It's the same feeling you get with excitement or anticipation. It's not a bad thing, it's just a thing. And this is great for people who suffer with anxiety, phobias, or depression. Also, once you're aware of how it works, when you get a positive feeling, you can go over it again and again in your mind and enjoy it more fully. Eventually it'll go away, but you can stretch it out if you so desire. And thus, the happy things make you happy for longer. But this is not magic. You can't just be told about it. You have to look. A little bit like when Morpheus says to Neo in The Matrix, No one can be told about the Matrix. They have to see it for themselves. Now, the first time I saw that movie, all them years ago, that didn't make any sense. What a load of crap, I thought. Of course you can be told about the Matrix. You can just sit a guy down and tell him, hey look, there's this computer simulation and you're in it. But really you can't, because if you just told somebody that, like literally just try it sometime, take a cousin or a friend and say, look, I've discovered we're living in the Matrix. They are just going to think you're a nutcase. And that's why no one can be told about the Matrix. It's not that you can't actually be told, it's just you can't be told and have it sink in. This is the same kind of thing, it's a self-selecting thing. Because the looking puts you in the right frame of mind to accept what you find. Because when you get right down to it, you're using your brain to look at things that aren't quite right in your brain. That's a little bit like trying to see the back of your own eyeball. It's not an easy thing to do. Now, there are more fetters in the process, but I can't tell you from personal experience about all of them because I've not experienced them for myself. But I'll go over them in a little bit of detail. The sixth fetter is form. This is more of a philosophical rather than an emotional one. It is the need to link the things we see to a function or a form. That a door, for example, is a door because it's a door, rather than door being simply a label that we apply to things that perform a function or act a certain way. Getting hung up on this means that you get stuck on the right usages of things and reinforce the idea of an inner self because we impose a clear border between that thing over there and us over here, when in reality there is just stuff happening, and we only think of ourselves as over here because all of our senses point outwards and we just exist in the negative space of all the things we don't see or sense out there. The idea with this fetter is to stop seeing the illusion and see what is actually there, and stop assuming that therefore there is an us because things are being seen. If there was an us, we will be able to find it in a mental inventory, and there is no us node in the brain or a consciousness node. It's all a product of the whole working together. The same is true for the mind. The seventh fetter is formlessness. It's a similar sort of thing, but regarding the absence of form, which I have not reached and I'm not sure I even understand it. So yeah, you might have to look that one up. The eighth fetter is the idea that you exist at all, your identity. It's a little bit like the first fetter where you discover there's not a self, but deeper. Like when the sixth fetter broke down the idea of a subject to subjectively view any object, and thus reinforce all of the above in terms of an identity and a subject to be seeing and a self. The ninth fetter, overexcitement. I'm not too sure about this one. I think it's sort of about being in the moment and not stressing out too much about stuff. You know, being what most people think of as kind of zen. The 10th fetter, avoiding the truth, ignoring or overlooking or shying away from examining what is there, wishing the world were other than it is. This is where much of the strain and stress comes from, because you want the world to be different, and it's not. Okay, so that's all of them. That's my experience of the few that I've done, the few that I've heard about, and my attempt to strip out the woo. Now that may not sound like much, but if you actually Google 10 fetters, you will get all sorts of bizarre religious stuff. And you will have a hell of a time picking through it to find the stuff that actually talks about things like experience and mentality and whatnot, and doesn't involve things like prayers and reincarnation and other stuff. Okay, so to recap, what do we get out of all of them? Well, we get to strip away some of the pretense and illusion about what we think we see, and see more clearly what is actually present, rather than to import all our baggage on what is there. We get relief from stress and worry as we learn to accept the world as it is, rather than stress out about the way we think the world should be and get disappointed or stressed out when it's not. We learn mindfulness, the art of understanding the operation of your own mind, and thus we learn some of what we are prone to or prone to avoid doing. We can gain a degree of separation between our mental state, our emotions, and the feelings in our body that trigger them. Freedom from fear, and thus freedom from the lingering effects of negative emotions. In short, we gain some measure of understanding about ourselves and a degree of peace. And as a side effect, you get some of the Buddhist-y or Zen sayings at long last, such as, the search for happiness is one of the chief sources of unhappiness. Or, if you are depressed, you are living in the past. If you are anxious, you are living in the future. If you are at peace, you are living in the present. Now, a lot of these sort of sayings can come off as deepities. They sound deep, but they're not. But when you've walked a little ways along this path, you kind of get it. You grok. There is a meaning there. Hopefully you can spot it. If it just sounds like some random crap that comes across on the internet, okay, but that might be a clue that you're not there yet. If any of this interests you, see link number 5 in the footnotes below this video, and feel free to ask any questions in the comments. And just to reiterate, I am not a Buddhist. I am an atheist. I also try to be a skeptic. Not talking magic or reincarnation. Just noticing that some of the foundational things we assumed about ourselves and about how our mind works is wrong. That's all for this week, kind of a long one. Tune in next week when we'll be discussing some more on essentialism and the outcome of it. Hopefully I will be able to get Diana Clarion on, aka the Lavender Lady, and we will be talking about it as a sort of a podcast thing, so it'll be a bit longer than normal. If not, well, I'll be doing it by myself, in which case it'll be a hell of a lot shorter. Probably nowhere near as long as this one. So there's that to look forward to. Bye for now.